Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. Greetings from one of the Graham Sustainability Institute's many satellite offices during this era of COVID. Thanks for joining us. We're really excited to be sharing an hour with you to talk about the energy revolution, why we think it's here, and how Graham and some of our colleagues at Michigan are involved in it. I want to especially thank those of you who had planned to join us on June 10th and are here tonight instead. That was the original date for this event, and we postponed it in support of the Shut Down Academia initiative to address systemic racism in academia. We recognize and appreciate all of you who stuck with us and are here with us tonight. Before we move on to our conversation, I want to go over a couple administrative items briefly. We've reserved about 20 minutes for questions at the end of the conversation, and you can submit them at any time using the Q&A feature. Post them as we go along, and we will get to as many of them as we can at the end. Also, I want you to know that live captioning is available during today's program. To view the captions, please click on closed caption at the bottom right of your screen. This afternoon, I'm really delighted to share with you some of the work Graham is doing and the lessons that we're learning, especially with respect to renewable energy and how it's affecting Michigan's rural communities. I'll be joined by our Graham's own Dr. Sarah Mills, who's the real expert on this subject. And our format this afternoon is going to be sort of like a video podcast in which I'll be asking questions, Sarah will be answering them in an informal back and forth, joined by you when we get to the questions part. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Graham Institute, I'd just briefly say that we were founded in 2006 to foster sustainability and sustainability research across the university. We're located in the Office of the Provost so that we can serve all the schools and colleges across the University of Michigan. And our founding is thanks to a very generous gift from Donald Graham, who's a graduate of the School of Engineering and whose father was a professor in the School of Natural Resources. And I think Don is actually on this call this afternoon out in the Zoom ether somewhere. So hi, Don, glad you're with us. At Graham, we aim to catalyze and facilitate sustainability-focused collaborations that involve faculty, students, and external stakeholders. We're sometimes called a boundary organization, but I want to make clear that we're more like a bridge. We are boundary spanning, we are not a border wall. Turning to this afternoon's topic, there are lots of entities who want to advance the energy revolution through developing wind and solar energy resources. And at Graham, part of what we do, and this is the focus of Dr. Mills' research, is to facilitate that transition to renewable energy by helping make sure that the development is of value to the communities where it is sited, and that their development decisions are made with a full understanding by the host communities of their ramifications. With that, I'd like to bring Sarah in to our conversation. Welcome, Sarah.
Thanks.
So Sarah, before we get to the meat of this topic, I would just like you to tell us, how did you get here? What brought you to Graham?
Well, I grew up in Michigan, and so coming to Graham was actually a bit of a homecoming. I did my PhD at U of M. I came back to study not energy, I came back to study farmland preservation, and ended up studying energy because wind farms in the state were being talked about as farmland preservation tool. So my involvement in Graham actually started when I was a PhD student. I was a Graham Dow scholar. And so what that meant is that I got to talk to other PhD students across campus about how energy infrastructure intersects with the food network and how that connects with water quality impacts and how that connects with economic development. And I really, really appreciated the ability to be able to see how interconnected these systems are, and effectively never left. I got my PhD at the end of 2015, I think, and I've stayed around ever since.
Well, that was to our benefit. We're really lucky to have you.
Thanks.
So let's talk about the title of this event. Why is the energy revolution here?
So I think it's here because, and the evidence of this is that we have been adding renewable energy to the grid faster than we ever have before. the US now produces more power from renewables than for coal. And that's the first time since like the 1880s. So like this is definitely gaining steam, and that revolution I think has taken place. The reason behind it, right, like why are we seeing this now is really, well, a lot of my work is about the economics, that the economics, the technology of the economics of the technology have changed really quickly. So wind is now the cheapest energy source in a lot of parts of the country. And the economics of solar have changed dramatically over the last decade. So solar, the costs have come down 90% in a decade. And that's way faster than I think anybody really expected. So for a while, we've had environmentally minded companies and consumers who have been asking for renewables. We've had state policies incentivizing or requiring it. But now we're seeing companies and utilities make, choices, including renewable energy, because that's their cheapest option, particularly when you kind of factor in the uncertainty about natural gas prices in the long haul. So, this idea that things have changed and changed really quickly, like it's requiring us to quickly reorient local officials who have a lot of power over whether these projects get cited. Last month, my students and I took over the issue of Planning and Zoning News, which is the big planning publication in the state of Michigan, to try to educate local officials that this landscape has changed really quickly and they need to be prepared for it.
Wow, that's excellent. Local officials, what kind of local officials, how many local officials are we talking about? Who does the planning in the state of Michigan?
Well, actually, that's one of the things that we included in our grant. We have a lot of local governments in Michigan, 1,856 when you count in the counties. And honestly, no one really knew who was responsible for zoning. It's kind of complicated. Sometimes in rural communities, the townships plan for themselves. They're responsible for their own zoning. Sometimes the counties plan for a bunch of rural townships. And in other places, it's kind of a free-for-all. There is no zoning. So one of the things that I've been doing is working with students to articulate who is responsible, and then document who actually has considered wind or solar within their zoning ordinance. I should say that Michigan, when we're thinking about renewable energy, different states have different models about whether the state is responsible for the zoning or that's delegated, like most land use things, to the local governments. But this idea of hyper-local, Michigan has 1,300 different governments that can set policies about whether or not you can build a wind or solar farm or even put solar panels on your roof. That's a little bit more than what you see in other places.
Wow. We must be right near at the top in terms of complexity then.
I kind of thought so, but this morning I was on the phone call with folks from Penn State Extension, because there's a lot of additional solar development going on there, and they claim that there are more local governments in Pennsylvania than we have here. And they also are kind of embarking on this effort to try to map and understand how local governments have been treating solar.
That just sounds like Penn State trying to argue that they have a higher score than the University of Michigan.
Could be.
Oh dear. Well, tell me more about the renewable energy scene in Michigan. You've mentioned solar. What other kinds of renewable energy do we have, and how are they developing?
Yeah, so right now about 12% of the power in Michigan comes from renewables, and most of that is from wind energy. And pretty much all of that wind development has been built since 2008. There were some small projects before then, but really renewables took off substantially, or our renewable development started in 2008. There are more wind projects that are being proposed and approved, but there's been a lot of resistance to wind in many communities. I mean, that's a lot of my work, is to try to understand why different communities react differently. as a result of that, a lot of utilities and private energy developers are really looking at solar. So if you look at the MISO queue, we're in the Midwest kind of grid. Developers have to effectively apply to see if there's space on the grid for their projects. And the MISO queue, there's 6 times as much solar as wind for the state of Michigan in planning. And in terms of like a scale, you know, we have about 2,000 megawatts of renewables right now in Michigan. There's 6,000 megawatts of solar in the queue. Not all of that will get built, but like there's a lot coming down the pike. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. And do you have a sense of like what % of our land cover in the state 6,000 megawatts of solar would be? Is there any competition then with our agricultural industry around building out that much solar?
So even 6,000 megawatts, it's a drop in the bucket, broadly speaking. Like I don't know that I've actually calculated the percentage of the land area that it is. I'll tell you, as a farmland preservation person, like this is one of the things that like I get asked about a lot, and in talking to communities, I think statewide, it's not very much, you know, we wouldn't recognize the difference. But what we need to think about is what impact it has on that local community. The project, some of the projects that we're seeing are 2,000 acres, which if you don't think in acres, if you think in like square miles, that's like 3 square miles, which is a significant land use change in a community. And so getting them to think about like, okay, what does this mean? What's happening there now? What can happen in conjunction with solar in the future? Is this a shift in our economy from one that's based on, you know, corn and soybeans to one that includes a lot of energy development? You know, that's something that I talk about a lot.
So you're starting to answer the question I was about to ask, which is if I were one of these local government officials and a solar developer came to me, what kind of questions should I be asking them and my community and people like you?
Well, I don't know how many local officials are on the phone, but really what I would say is that the local officials should be asking people like me or others, they should be thinking about solar before the developer shows up. I think that's one of our big problems, is that a lot of local officials are being reactive rather than thinking like, okay, this is a new-ish land use for Michigan. It's a new land use for Michigan. Does it fit here? How does it fit with our long-term goals? I mean, when we think about land use, particularly in rural communities, a lot of those, you know, a lot of our land use goals are associated with economic development. And so some rural communities have productive-based economic development plans. They're really about ag, right? And solar energy brings a lot of additional revenue to those farmers and allows them to diversify their farm income just like wind did before it. Mm-hmm. Other rural communities are based on amenities, right? And so like if you really want to build your local economy around tourism, how are owners of cottages going to feel about solar panels? There's not a lot of research on that. That's something that we're trying to capture right now. But those are the kind of things that you should think about ideally before a developer shows up. And then like what you can do is you can either do things that would attract a developer to your community, whether it's a wind developer or solar developer, or you can effectively send a message like, maybe developer, like there's not a huge opportunity here, like go look somewhere else, or think about a small project here. But what local officials are doing all the time is kind of weighing the different competing interests in their community, like what different landowners want, you know, what their economic plans are, you know, how this fits into their image. Like solar is something that's possible also in urban areas. And so if you've got a climate action plan, like solar would allow you to have a really visible project, right? That's possible in your community. Wind is a little bit trickier in urban environments just because of the space that's required. So I would say start early, like don't wait for the developer.
Don't wait for the developer to show up. And I guess for you know, officials who are trying to speed the transition, because given the climate crisis coming, we need to decarbonize our electricity as quickly as possible. Are tax breaks for the utilities the right way to go?
So not all taxes are created equal, is what I would say. You know, there are federal tax breaks on renewable energy, and a lot of that has helped to speed the adoption and get the cost down, right? Like anything else, the more you do it, the more you learn, the quicker the costs are going to come down. And so there are still some federal tax incentives associated with renewables, and they have been helpful. Generally speaking, you would think if you want more of something, you cut taxes on it. But particularly for the really big projects, one of the key reasons that communities want to host the project is because of the economic benefits that it brings. And some of those are directly to the landowners, but there's some equity issues associated there, right? Like it's really the people who are wealthy enough to own large tracts of land who are the ones who are hosting wind turbines or solar panels on their properties. But the other economic benefits are in the form of property taxes. That's true in most states. That's certainly true in Michigan, is that wind and solar developers pay property taxes that stay in the local government to fund local government services. And so you don't actually want to cut all of those taxes. Now you might, if there's another rationale in your community for having a project, maybe it's like, maybe you want to improve your image, or you have a brownfield, right? A site that was used for something else in the past, and like nothing is being developed there. If you have a climate action plan, like you want to show your commitment to sustainability, then you don't need the tax revenue necessarily. You have this piece of property that nobody's developing on, let's put solar panels there, or let's cover our landfill, right, in solar. You don't necessarily need to do that as a revenue making opportunity. So maybe you are good with cutting the taxes there. But for a lot of communities, and particularly when you're talking about wind or solar on like green fields, that kind of thinking about the economic aspect of it is really important. And I mean, I've done research, like interviews of wind and solar developers, and they tell me like, we're happy to pay taxes if they stay in the local communities, because they see that as just, you know, that's part of their kind of exchange with that local community.
That makes sense. Makes a lot of sense. So I want to circle back a minute to the focus on solar. We're not Arizona. We're not, you know, I'm looking outside and it's partly cloudy, but certainly much of the winter it's really cloudy. So why does solar work here?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons that it's increasingly working is because the cost of solar panels has come down. So it's pretty cheap. The other reason that it works is that we use a lot of electricity on hot, sunny days, right, for air conditioning. And so it, like, at least how, like, our energy demand right now, like solar matches when we need that power pretty well. I should note, like, when we're thinking about bigger, like, not just the current electricity grid, but doing carbon neutrality and thinking about decarbonizing economy-wide, that our load is not always going to match that. Our peak demand for electricity may not necessarily be in the summer months. Because in Michigan, for example, we have a whole lot of home heating that is done with natural gas. Right. And natural gas, like, to achieve carbon neutrality goals, we're going to have to phase out a lot of that. And so once we electrify that, we're going to, you know, we're going to have a higher need for electricity in the winter months as well, when you're going to want to think about some, you know, maybe wind is more complementary there. So, and believe it or not, like, this is the kind of fun fact that I often like to give my class. There's a higher percentage of rooftop solar panels in the Upper Peninsula, which gets a lot more snow, than there is in the Lower Peninsula.
Really? Interesting. Why is that?
The cost of electricity in the UP is about twice what it is in the Lower Peninsula. And so those panels pay for themselves a whole lot faster. So this really, it's, you know, economics are kind of entwined in that discussion as well.
You know, you're reminding me, one of our student projects a couple of years ago, we have a Dow Master's Fellows program. I think a group of our students were in the Upper Peninsula working with the community on evaluating the benefits to that community of community solar. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, I think that they were kind of looking at, so community solar is this idea where people buy, they were looking at community solar in the UP, I think. That's the right project, right? So community solar is this idea where people buy solar panels at a larger solar project. And I think one element that they were looking at is how you can get low-income communities involved, or low-income residents involved in this. It's kind of a project that's peripherally related to the grant that I have with EAGLE. That's the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. That's where the Michigan's Energy Office is. So yeah, there's a community solar project in the UP.
Mm-hmm. And the issue around giving low-income people access to renewable energy and solar in particular, that sounds like some of the work that Tony Ream has done as well, right?
That's right. So for people on the call who don't know, Tony is a faculty member in SEAS, the School for Environment and Sustainability, one of the units within U of M. They were formerly the SNRE, School for Natural Resources, if there's alums on the call that were there long ago. Yeah, that's right. That's a project that Tony is working on. And he's, there's a former student of mine who is starting his PhD with Tony this fall, who actually worked for EAGLE last summer on kind of their low-income community solar project. And I think that that's something that he and Tony are working on, again, kind of going forward.
That's great. That's great. And the question of low-income communities, communities of color, disparity, and discrimination in the world of energy and access to renewable energy. Just curious what kind of connections you see between the energy revolution and the problem of systemic racism that has been there for a huge long time, but which many of us across the country are focused increasingly on.
Yeah, well, it's something that I've really grappled with because I'll be honest, most of the rural communities in Michigan that currently have utility scale renewable energy, power plants that have wind farms, and just generally Michigan rural communities that have the land area to host these big projects are predominantly white. And so like trying to figure out like, how is what I'm saying fit into this conversation? I took that shutdown academia day to heart to like contemplate this. One of the key things that's involved here is that our coal-fired power plants and even our natural gas plants are disproportionately put in communities of color. And so shutting those power plants down definitely has health and environmental benefits particularly in Black and in lower income communities. And so, whatever we can do to facilitate making sure that there is space, to allow for renewables to come on helps to close those plants sooner. I think one of the things that we don't think about, and maybe it's because like the economics of this are central to my work and I've like learned about property taxes. We know that there is an environmental and a health good of closing coal-fired power plants. And we often think about like the workers in coal mines and trying to figure out what they're going to do when, we transition away from coal. And maybe we even think about the workers in the coal-fired power plants themselves. But I think what we don't think about is like those coal plants as being taxpayers in those communities. And so a lot of the places that currently host them are going to see huge economic losses in tax revenue. And so one of the things that we need to start figuring out, and I just don't think there's a lot of work on that, is like, how are we going to replace that money? That's just one kind of aspect of this. You could put solar panels on that same land area, but there's not as much investment dollars in those solar panels as there is in that coal-fired power plant. And so we need to start thinking not just about coal workers, right, but also about like the people that are living in communities with coal-fired power plants and what this transition means to them. And Tony's work gets at part of that. And there are others that are working on, you know, energy justice, but I think that a whole lot more needs to be done. I mean, I would love to do more reading, you know, like on how this geographic difference of where we're building new renewables and where we're closing coal plants meshes or doesn't, and how it's integrated with systemic racism. So I don't know if there are researchers out there who are listening to our conversation, like that is my call to action. Like, please add your research. Like, I would love to read it because I know the rural side of the equation, but I'll admit that I am only coming to learn kind of the urban side.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks for that call to action as well. And I would just add that Graham as an institute would also be interested in seeing if there are ways to support you in that work. As I said at the beginning of our call, much of Graham's mission is to be there to facilitate engaged research for our faculty with external stakeholder communities around the questions that they really need answering. And we can provide support in a variety of forms of convening, of sharing your resources, providing some communications help, of helping you find the right stakeholders and to work with. I mean, some faculty already do this brilliantly across the university, but there are other faculty who are answering the call to become more engaged in their research, and we at Graham very much want to help with that. So that would be great. Sarah, tell me more about other parts of your work. What else are you working on?
Oh, goodness. So some of the work that I do is on the range of policies that affect renewable energy deployment. So a lot of this is work from prior to being at Graham. I was at the Ford School of Public Policy for a while and worked with Barry Rabe, whose kind of expertise is on carbon taxes. And the impetus for this is that there's a whole lot, like we pay a whole lot of attention to like renewables policies and carbon taxes and these big policies setting out goals, but that there are a whole bunch of other policies in play that actually play out differently and may have led some of the conservative states, honestly, to be leaders in this. And so one of the things that he's focused on is severance taxes. So these are taxes that are paid when you take fossil fuels out of the ground. You know, when you have high severance taxes, it's baked in then to the kind of price of oil and gas. And so that can kind of alter kind of the economic equation between wind or renewables and fossil fuels. And so in some ways it's a carbon tax, right? Like it's a tax on fossil fuels, but it's a tax that's like, there's not climate in its name or even carbon in its name. And it's way more popular and it's pretty ubiquitous in Republican states. And so like, yeah.
It is one where you make more money the more you use and the more you extract. So there's an incentive to use more for the communities that are benefiting from it. But still, that's a very interesting point. Very interesting question.
Yeah. So so the kind of things that I'm working on in that world are taxation, right? We talked a little bit about that. And because solar is such a new land use in Michigan, like the state is still trying to figure out like, how do we tax it? And there are pros and cons. Like there's this balance, like we talked about before, of not wanting the tax to be too high, that you're not able to build a solar project, but wanting to make sure that there's something in it for local communities. And so one of the things that I've been doing kind of to that end is both working with people who are, you know, smarter than me in tax policy in Ford School and elsewhere to understand like what's the pros and cons, but also kind of with my Graham hat on now, a couple weeks ago, we pulled together like a stakeholder group of developers and local community representatives and tax people to say like, right now the situation isn't great because it's like nobody quite knows what's going on. Like what would a good tax system look like going forward?
Great. And again, that's our sweet spot at Graham. Glad you're doing it.
Yeah, and it's not for us to push an agenda, it's just to pull the right stakeholders together, and stakeholders that might not normally be in the same place, right?
That's right. Exactly. And which is such an important piece of finding solutions. And I think that some of us think that addressing climate change, getting to carbon neutrality is about the technological fix. And if we just had the right engineering solution, but it sounds like in your areas of renewable energy, an awful lot of it is the social sciences, the behavioral science, the economics of it, the policy. So these are really interdisciplinary problems. We talked about the energy revolution being here, but it also sounds like there are some barriers. Are there other barriers we haven't talked about? In terms of what could get in the way of this going forward? Or what is?
Well, I mean, I think like going back to that, right? Like people want to know, taxes are a big part of, the expenses. So people want to know what the policy is. But when you have such a rapid transition, policies haven't kept up. And so I think that that's one of the barriers. You also, in the state of Michigan, at least, you have to have, in order for something to be built, like you have to have local governments articulate that within their zoning ordinance, right? And if they're not seeing this as a land use, there are at least delays, if not outright like inability to build projects. And so trying to make sure that our policies and programs are changing to keep pace with like the change of technology and the new technologies now that are available that weren't available a decade ago, I think is really important. I think, what I often balance, I talk to planning commissions in rural communities a lot because again, that's where like the big power plants tend to go. But I also sit on the planning commission in the city of Ann Arbor. And much like the university has a carbon neutrality commission, which you chair, and I'd like to hear more about that in a minute. The city council just passed a carbon neutrality plan. Cities are calling for renewable energy and, system like economy-wide reductions and decarbonization, but don't necessarily have the land for this. And so they're going to have, those renewable energy power plants to make that possible are going to have to be sited outside of the city. Some can happen in the city and we should do everything that we can, but some are going to happen out of the city. And I think one of the things that hasn't been talked about a lot is this idea that this energy transition could exacerbate an urban-rural divide if we're not careful. We need to be able to better articulate how energy is how renewable energy fits within rural communities and make them see that this is something good for them. And it's not good for everybody, but we need to build on that so that we can hopefully use this transition as an opportunity to bridge some of those divides, be they geographical or racial, rather than exacerbate them. And so I feel like that's an area where we're on the transition, but we need to be careful.
And learning more about your work has also really made clear to me the complexity around the regulatory and legal regime it's multi-layered, federal, state, local. Certainly with thinking about the renewable resources in this country, an awful lot of the wind is in the middle of the country, it's in the Northeast, a lot of the solar is in the Southwest, but even if the entire United States as a whole has plenty of renewable energy, if we don't get through FERC and federal regulators to help connect and build new transmission lines, we can't share those resources very efficiently across different parts of the country. So.
Absolutely. And I would just say too, like that's totally right. And I feel like there's some attention now to transmission and the idea that we need to be thinking a little bit more about this. Again, maybe it's because I'm like a local government person or like talk to a lot of landowners. One of the things that you have to think about is like, well, how do the people whose property that transmission lines run across feel about that? And generally, in terms of like the equity in a transition, generally for transmission lines, those transmission companies have the power of eminent domain, which means that they can effectively force the landowner to require that transmission line to run across their property, which does not sit well with a lot of folks, right? And so like, how can you get them to, what does it look like to make people feel like this is not, this energy transition, this transmission line, this renewable energy power plant is not something foisted on them, like that they're bearing a burden, but rather that they're part of the solution. Like, we haven't figured that out, but we need to.
We need to. And speaking of things we need to figure out, you've told us a lot about the things that you're working on. If we could clone you, or if we had additional resources, what else should we be doing? What are the questions that you know need attention and need to be researched?
So I think one of the big ones is, again, maybe it's because I'm a planner, right? And like, I want communities to be proactive. And it bothers me that largely they're reactive. They're waiting for a developer to come and they're looking at one kind of clean energy solution and not all of them. And they tend to be like narrowly focused on land use impacts, but there are economic impacts. Like, I feel like we need to do a much more robust job at articulating what is the value proposition and what are the drawbacks and what are the implications for environmental systems of different energy technologies, for land use, for local jobs, and integrate that together, like help communities on that. The other thing, and again, at some point I'm gonna put you on the spot, Jennifer, to talk a little bit more, but okay. I think there's some communities, not all of them, but some communities really do wanna move toward carbon neutrality. And one of the things, because this is something that the university is working on, that's something that I hope that we can help them think about. Like, if we're going to achieve it ourselves as a university, like, we're gonna end up learning a lot of lessons, and we have access to a whole bunch of resources, both economic, but also really like fundamental research, right? Resources that other communities don't have. And so I feel like helping communities, like taking what we've learned or what we're going to learn and translating that and how it fits, not just in Michigan, but elsewhere too, with different utility structures, different resource availability, right? I think that's something that I would love to see Graham do in the future.
I would too. And I can speak to that a little bit briefly, and then we need to open it to the questions from our wonderful audience. But you've mentioned the President's Commission on Carbon Neutrality, which I have the privilege of co-chairing with Steve Forrest, which, for those who aren't familiar with it, is the University of Michigan's commitment to find a pathway to carbon neutrality. We've set up a commission to recommend solutions to President Schlissel by the end of this calendar year to do so. One of the aspects of our charge is that the solutions we come up with, we also should find solutions that are scalable and transferable to the regional community and beyond. And that's because, as important as it is for the University of Michigan to find our own pathway to carbon neutrality, what will really, really have impact is if we find solutions that we can then take out to other institutions, other universities, work with the city of Ann Arbor, and then take that to other communities, as you've talked about, and that can cross just the whole array of solutions, from building standards to what's the mix that we're going to come up with to replace our natural gas power plant as our electricity source, behavioral changes, well, we get members of the community to take on more personal responsibility. How do we fly less? Right now during COVID, I'm not flying at all, but how do we go beyond that? So those are all features. And then there's another aspect of what Graham is doing that I think will also be helpful to the wider community, which is, again, with a very generous gift from an anonymous donor, President Schlissel has asked us to set up a faculty research fund for carbon neutrality research. And we'll be putting out the first request for proposals soon, but that will also include a component that focuses on engaged research with communities. So what's the research our wonderful faculty can be doing on carbon neutrality with community stakeholders, and then taking that more broadly out well beyond Washtenaw County, well beyond the state of Michigan, to the rest of the world. So Sarah, this has been a wonderful conversation, and we will now continue it with what our audience wants to ask. So give me a moment while I open up our questions.
Great.
And let me see. I think one that I will start with is this is one from our audience. To what extent are solar energy projects through, for instance, power purchase agreements being restricted by state regulations or utilities?
So usually when you're talking about, once you bring in PPAs, power purchase agreements, you're talking about bigger projects. And I'll be honest that most of my work is on either the legislative side. A lot of this has to do with regulations, right? What happens through the Public Utilities Commission. In Michigan, ours is called the Michigan Public Service Commission, MPSC. A lot of those rules are, laying out like evaluating a utility's plans for what power plants that they're going to be able to buy. And sometimes, like, you need to figure out different public service commissions evaluate those proposals differently. And so Michigan has been touted as like doing a good thing. Now a lot of states are kind of doing this and requiring integrated resource planning. So like you need to consider all options, not just the one that you want, but lots of options going forward. And so that's one of the things that kind of play into that. There's a lot of complexity in like whether you're in a regulated market or a deregulated market, and I do not profess to know all of that. But that's one of the things, like Katie Hausman is at the Ford School and she knows a whole lot more about like utility regulation, and so I would point you her way. But also like we try to pull her in like and educate me when we've got questions like that.
That's great. How can we incentivize building owners and landlords to add renewables to their buildings and make them more energy efficient, even when the electricity bills are the responsibility of the tenants? Any thoughts on that?
This idea of a split incentive is something that a lot of people are talking about. I wish I knew this. One of my, I think the city of Holland in Michigan is doing something with this. They have a municipal utility, and so they've been trying to identify solutions to this split incentive approach. It was not just, was it renewable energy or was it also about energy efficiency?
It was about both.
Okay, so I mean, a lot of Tony Ream's work on the renewable energy side, and even to some extent on the energy efficiency side, seeing this gap between, both based on income and based on race, is just in deployment of solar, rooftop solar in particular, is because of this disparity in home ownership, right? And so there is that the split incentive exists is documented. There are states that are trying to fill this gap in some ways by doing carve-outs for, particular communities where there are high levels of rental homes. The city of Ann Arbor, one of the things that's been floated, and I don't kind of know where it is right now, is can you require, on the energy efficiency side now, can you require during rental inspections some kind of energy efficiency audit of those as well, and that you have a minimum, just like you have minimum safety standards, that you also have minimum energy efficiency standards that a landlord has to meet in order to get recertified to be able to rent out their property. So again, like, there are some things, and there's a couple good resources out there. I work a lot with the National Conference of State Legislators. There's actually a Ford School alum who is in their energy office, so she points me to a lot of their resources. And they compile a lot of this information on the different energy policies that are allowed in different states. That's, that's like Sarah's scratching the surface. It's most of my stuff is kind of on the big utility scale project side.
Mhm. Great. Your comment about landlords and energy efficiency standards for landlords is something that I believe the city of Ann Arbor is looking into, and it's one of the places where there's a real synergy between the city's carbon neutrality goals and the university's carbon neutrality goals, because a lot of the not terribly energy efficient housing in the city of Ann Arbor is low cost housing for our students. And so we are responsible in part for those emissions, even though they're not directly attributable to the university.
Yeah.
Here's one back to the local communities trying to decide what to do about siting renewable energy. This question is curious whether you know of any innovative or creative solutions that you've seen in developers supporting the local communities beyond the financial benefit from siting the facility there. Are there other examples of utilities, developers working to benefit the local communities?
So there are examples of like participation in K-12, STEM, effectively trying to build the workforce that can then, be able to, a local workforce that can service those renewable energy projects. I can tell you, like, most of the jobs in renewable energy are in construction, and so like once the big solar farm or wind farm is built, like there's fewer long-term jobs, but there are some. But if you don't have training programs to, in the community college to have people prepared to take on those jobs, then it's also people that aren't necessarily from that rural community that are there too. My very first Dow master's project that I advised when I was at the Ford School was with a group of students that were looking at community benefits agreements associated with renewables projects, and particularly from the wind side, just because there's a lot more development on that, and how it might translate for solar. And so usually there is some economic component, like a developer will say, I have this much money that I'm able to spend, but many times they effectively put either donate it to a community foundation or establish a community foundation for the community to figure out, like, what do we want to put this towards? There's an example of, like, I think in that Dow students report about building a walking trail around around a ball field in one of these communities with a wind farm, or contributing to a community center. So I was on the phone earlier this week because this idea of like community benefits is something that the state of New York is taking up right now, and they're trying to figure out, like, how big should those be? Should like developers be offering a rebate on utility bills, or should there be like a environmental fund that they are contributing to that the community decides? So it's a really active area. I think there's not tons of academic research, but there's more that could be done, certainly. And understanding, again, like, communities want to feel like there's something, that this is a good for them. There's a global benefit, we know, right, by having more renewables deployment. But like for a community, it's changing their landscape, if nothing else. And so we want to make, I think it's important to make sure that communities don't feel like they're being taken advantage of and that this is a burden on them, but rather something that they want.
I grew up with exactly that trade-off. I grew up in a very small town in southern Indiana on the Ohio River, and we had a view out the window of the river and Kentucky, and it was beautiful, but we also saw in that same view the Clifty Creek Power Plant, which is one of the biggest coal-fired power plants in the Ohio River Valley, and it created the jobs as well as the pollution. So it's I appreciate that. Another question from actually an alum of our Graham Scholars Program and a solar developer who says, can we speak to Michigan's specific state policy for renewables? Are you aware of any new policies or extensions of current policy that are proposed to encourage renewable development in the state? And right off the bat, I would say a lot of Sarah's work is being funded by the state government. So you know that people is promoting and trying to help advance renewable energy. But do you have other answers, Sarah, that you can help with?
Well, again, kind of getting back to the idea that maybe what the person is referring to is like, often what we think about is, are we going to extend the renewable portfolio standard?
Yes.
Right? Like, that's where a lot of people think. And that's a good question, and I don't know. I haven't heard any talk about that. And again, like, a lot of the utilities have projected in their, latest integrated resource plans, substantial increases in the amount of renewables that they have. Maybe not on the timeline that we actually need for, actually staving off the worst impacts of climate change, but they're there. And so I think that there's always this kind of push and pull. Like I said, I also think though about like taxation. So kind of sorting out solar taxation is something that's on the agenda right now, that I think will help on the utility scale solar side. In case like you're wondering, there was a question about taxation on the like residential side for rooftop solar panels that the legislature took up and that the governor signed. I think it was last fall. It could have even been before that. So effectively, that's kind of been sorted out. Going forward, right? Like, I think we need to do a whole lot more thinking, and honestly, some of this is modeling, better planning about how if the university wants to achieve carbon neutrality, like, there's got to be a change in the utility system as well, right? Like, hopefully we're not going to achieve it alone. As you were saying, Jennifer, like, how can this scale, right? And so we need to think about like how we're actually going to do it. What is the mix of resources? Will we include offshore wind, like in the Great Lakes in that? There's been some holdup of the offshore wind project that was being planned in Lake Erie off the coast of Cleveland. Like, is offshore wind something that Michigan is going to consider in that? Are we going to do additional nuclear? Like, how are we going to take, what does that mix look like? I feel like those conversations, I know that bits and pieces of them are starting, and I expect that they will need to continue in the future.
No, I think that's a great point, which is, as you said, we've got great opportunity for solar with our summer peak, but as we try to transition away from our natural gas heating, we've got to figure out how to deal with the winter peak, and that will require additional sources of renewable energy. So time to start preparing and answering those questions now. Here's one. If a municipality does not have zoning laws for renewables, is development by the government or residents allowed? Can they just go ahead in that vacuum, or do you need to update the zoning laws before a developer could come in?
So it's a little bit complicated. But what I would say is there are some places, like I said, that are unzoned, and then it's kind of a free-for-all. And in response to like a big project, some of those unzoned places there have been some movements towards like, we want to take up zoning. Like, we want to actually establish zoning laws for that. So that's kind of one situation. In the situation, which is that many of the communities in the state are in, where they have zoning, but they're silent on solar in particular, because that's much more true of solar than wind. There's kind of two different things, and I think it depends on scale. So for utility scale solar, it is pretty much solar as the primary land use, not like an accessory like rooftop solar, but the primary land use. The way that the zoning laws in Michigan are written is generally like a use is not allowed unless it is explicitly permitted by that zoning ordinance. So in most cases, that's not allowed. They would need to change their ordinance to talk about utility scale solar, and then they could do it.
Mhm.
The
Okay.
where I would say one thing about rooftop solar is that's the weird one. There's a lot of places where like rooftop solar is not mentioned in the zoning ordinance, but we know it's there. And it's just because it's interpreted by the local government as just another roof covering, right? And so like it's, or another kind of piece of the mechanical equipment, it's just allowed. And even in the city of Ann Arbor until a year ago, ground mounted solar that was, you know, rather, if you didn't have space on your roof, you put it on in your yard, that was just considered an accessory structure. And so now we've explicitly called out where solar panels that are on the ground are allowed. But that but I'm sure that there are other communities like Ann Arbor where it is allowed because it's being called something else. But I'm encouraging communities to be explicit, because then everybody has an idea of what the rules are.
Great. Very, very helpful. And thanks for mentioning Ann Arbor, because that links us to the last question. We're out of time. So the last question, if you could briefly address, wearing both your University of Michigan hat and your City Commission hat, how can the University of Michigan and the city work together to promote renewables? Any suggestions?
We need to work together. So the city of Ann Arbor has no say over the land use on University of Michigan property. Like, you know, you know, even if we require something on everybody else's private property, the city can't require that on the University of Michigan. But clearly, like, we're working towards the same goals, right? So, I mean, I think one of the clear things that we can do is be more, in my mind, it's not necessarily renewables, but it's more about carbon neutrality, is that we know that the university is a huge employer, and we have a whole lot of people commuting into this city. So we need to be more intentional, and those are contributing to emissions, right? They're not, as much as we would like them to be taking the bus, they're not all taking the bus. Many of them are driving in cars. So we need to be, I think we need to be doing more about like getting in sync about our parking and like the parking rates, figuring out like whether and where some of those people can live, or if we can be more flexible and maybe take a page from the COVID book and not have them commute every day. I think where there is university property abutting public lands, we could look at what the opportunities are for renewable energy, but effectively, like, the university and the city working together, like, we're pretty big customers of our utility, right? And so I think that there's more that we need to do to help ensure that, like, we're in sync as we are trying to figure out how we can purchase more renewable energy from the grid. So that's, again, not with I can't speak for the Planning Commission, and none of those things were specifically Planning Commission anyway, but that's Sarah's 2 cents worth.
Sarah's personal views. Those are helpful. And I would add to that, you know, ideas about how to increase electric vehicle use too, by charging station placement, and what are the incentives around commuting through cleaner vehicles as well. Anyway, Sarah, thank you so very much for the fascinating perspectives you've presented today on the energy revolution. And I could keep going, but we have to wrap it up. So I would just say, for our audience, we still have some more questions coming in. We will do our best. If you would like to email them to us, we'll still try to follow up and continue the conversation afterwards. I would like to thank everyone in this audience, as all of our supporters and friends who joined us tonight, this afternoon. What we do here at the Graham Institute, we believe, is critical to the sustainability of the planet, and now more than ever, we welcome and need your support. We rely deeply on the community and greatly appreciate all the contributions that you've made. We are considering doing more of these talks in the future to showcase other work at the university. And if you have any ideas about what you'd like to hear about, please feel free to share those with us. And I look forward to continuing the conversation with you. And with that, I thank you again and wish you all a good evening. Goodbye.